these truths to be self-evident.
That all men are created equal.
As a member of Congress, I get to have a lot of really interesting people in the office. Experts on what they're talking about.
This is the podcast
For insights into the issues.
China, bioterrorism, Medicare for all. In-depth discussions.
Breaking it down into simple terms. We hold
these truths.
We hold these truths.
With Dan Crenshaw.
The Eagle has landed.
All right, everybody. Here's an exciting topic for you. Permitting. All right, but I promise you this is more exciting than you think because it has to do with your everyday life, how much your gas costs, how much electricity costs, whether you even have electricity. This is important. Infrastructure is important. You've heard for years now that we're going to have some big infrastructure bill. Well, what does that mean and what's in the way? Even if we had a bunch of money, how easy would it be to actually build the things we need? And how many unknown species of birds do we have to think about and protect while we do that? And so there's a ton of federal regulations that inhibit that, but also protect our environment. And so they're important, and it's even more important to get it right. And so to help us with that conversation, I have with me Alex Herrgott. Wait, did I say your name right? Herrgott?
Yes.
I said it two different ways, but it sounds good. Alex, thanks for being on the show.
Yeah, no problem.
And you're the executive director of the Federal Permitting Improvement Steering Council. So, hey, appreciate you being on the show.
Well, thank you, Congressman Crenshaw. I appreciate your interest in the issue. And you're right. Oftentimes when we talk about permitting and bureaucracy and red tape, everyone throws their hands up and says, well, that's government for you. And the reality is that over the last 30 or 40 years, since Republicans created the EPA in recognition that there needs to be minimum standards for lead in the water and things of that nature, that Congress, very similar to every good idea, if you picture it as a stone in a backpack, every stone becomes a new idea that's added to the laws. And by the time you get to where we are today, there's so many stones in the backpack that we can't get anywhere.
Yeah, I see that in the public narrative quite a bit. Like there's this, it's like there's this, for some reason, there's this belief that there's just no regulations and that if you're against further regulations, then you basically just want, sludge in the water and you want smoke in the air and you want birds falling from the sky. It's really crazy. There's no education on what's already in place.
The reality is when I was down the Macondo oil spill with, at that time, the commander of the overall federal response, Thad Allen, who was the former commandant of the Coast Guard, he said to me and taught me an important lesson. He said, Alex, there's always going to be a conflict between the natural environment and human activity. And the difference between Republicans and Democrats is that Republicans believe in the world in which it is and not the world we want it to be, and that there is risk in every decision, and that the true trick is to capture the balance. And in that balance is when we actually figure out the risk-based nature of how we actually figure out how we fuel this machine called America, while we also protect human health and safety. And that is the big difference between Republicans and Democrats. Is the Democrats believe in the precautionary principle, in which do no harm and absolutely no development can occur under any situation. And that is not how we actually build and foster manufacturing and the reshoring of additional jobs. And that is the fundamental difference. Is how to navigate the Endangered Species Act and the Clean Air Act and the Clean Water Act and the Safe Drinking Water Act, so that we can actually build things in this country while also being good stewards of natural resources.
The frustrating thing is if a Democrat was on this conversation with you, they would violently disagree with you, right? They would say, that is of course not what we want. We just want common sense environmental regulations. And they're very good at making that argument, but their actions are wildly different. And they support these groups that back them are very radical, and they make what is already a burdensome process even more burdensome with excessive lawsuits and just constant pressure against building the infrastructure that we need. So,
yeah, you're exactly right, and it's not just that; it's the manipulation of the courts. In that they're activist judges that are not science-based deciders of policy, and what has happened is that the trial bar in the environmental community has become very astute at using the courts to get things done that they can't do with statutes and regulations that were bipartisanly approved. Things that were done in the Obama and Clinton administration are how we're operating our environmental laws now, but all of a sudden they're no longer acceptable. and
Right.
they're no longer acceptable for oil and gas, but they're okay for long transmission lines that have more disruptive impact on wetlands and streams for renewable energy than oil and gas, yet they're held to a different standard.
Yeah, and so you had a council. Like I said, it's the what is it? The executive. You're the Federal Permitting Improvement Steering Council, and so the whole point of this thing is to get things approved, kind of be a sort of quarterback for the many different agencies that we have where permitting regulations are written. And this was created in 2015 under the FAST Act, but not implemented until President Trump took office. So tell me more about that.
Sure. So like anything else in DC, the Federal Permitting Improvement Steering Council, FIPSI, is a long acronym. And I think in DC, as in most places, unlike most places, the longer the acronym, the more powerful you are. But in DC, it's pretty much back to basics for this office. It was created by 83 senators in the entire Democratic House to create a one-stop shop by statute, not by executive order, that would be a clearinghouse that is a voluntary program for projects of $200 million or more that are subject to one of the vast environmental reviews, that instead of having to hire lobbyists to navigate 13 federal agencies, 26 executive orders, and God knows how many regulations and court orders, that there would finally be an office that was within the federal family that treated those putting capital at risk, mayors, governors, the private sector, to build projects, whether it be a pipeline or a transmission line or farmers building a water supply for agriculture and the rest, that they were finally treated like customers rather than adversaries in a black box that had previously required up to 20 to 30% of a project to be wasted just on attorneys on checking all of the federal boxes. And so this council is an office that is funded by Congress at about $8 million a year, with a sole job of removing the headwinds and the red tape for projects across 9 sectors, including manufacturing, pipelines, renewable energy, transmission lines, surface transportation, aviation, ports and waterways, and several others. Currently, we manage about $250 billion worth of projects, which makes us the largest ombudsman of its kind that's actually able to provide a decision. And oftentimes in federal government, there's a decision desert where the 13 federal agencies point a finger at each other and point at different directions when tough decisions need to be made. And finally, under this president, and with the help of Congress, with the additional resources and support with members like yourself, we're finally actually able to give project sponsors an answer when trying to build a project, to keep a process that traditionally takes 7 years and knock that down to well below 2 years, so that we can actually start constructing and building economic recovery.
Yeah, that's hugely important. I mean, again, we talk about infrastructure spending all the time. Let's have an infrastructure bill. And I'm always like, well, what does that mean exactly? You know, you've got to create an environment where infrastructure can be built. And you know, again, I'm not opposed to an infrastructure bill. I would always like to know what people are talking about when they discuss it. And, you know, the first of all, private money knows where it needs to be allocated best. That's step one. And you don't want government unnecessarily inhibiting that. And so you need a process that's actually coherent and makes sense. So it sounds like we're on our way to creating that if we haven't created it already, which is great news.
Well, it's good you pointed that out. I think that, you know, when it comes to the gas tax that goes into the Highway Trust Fund, or the $1 billion a year we spend on the Safe Drinking Water Revolving Fund that's spread across 50 states, the federal government actually doesn't own any infrastructure in this country. The 4 million miles of roads, there's only a small 0.01% that is owned by the federal government. That's typically Park Service roads and refuge roads and Forest Service roads. All of the interstates and rural roads that are in Texas are owned by Texans, and they're and the responsibility for maintenance and new capital improvements for water systems and the rest are entirely borne by governors, mayors, county supervisors, judges, and the private sector. And so there's a misnomer when we talk about infrastructure that everyone just focuses on the highway bill. But what actually funds the pipeline that allows toilets to flush and pipelines that allow lights to be turned on, and harnessing the natural gas energy revolution? How do we actually get the cheap source of natural gas out to the ports of Corpus Christi and Brownsville and Houston, to actually build on the economic renaissance of the country. That's actually going to build back our GDP, whereas currently our number one export by volume is cardboard and paper we send to China. We can't just worry about building roads. We actually have to build and restore the transmission lines in the country that are 70 years old, or the water systems that were built after World War II. Those are the kinds of things that I always say are the silent crisis, that are public good. Everyone doesn't necessarily know what they cost until it's broken, and we have a Flint, Michigan situation. However, most infrastructure in this country is entirely supported by the private sector and by local tax dollars.
And I think a lot of the inhibitions or the obstacles to even to improving those pieces of infrastructure are permitting and the regulations that are put upon them. I mean, go ahead.
I mentioned this at the beginning, but the reality is that 20 to 30% of a project right off the top is just the red tape and the uncertainty. And it's not just about reducing the cost, it's the gating fee. Essentially, a project that goes from red to green. Sometimes when it goes to mayors that have to get local bond initiatives or tax revenue, oftentimes what they end up having to charge, they build in something called a development cost. And the rating agencies in New York and Wall Street and what governors and mayors have to go to bond measures with or to the state legislature, those costs are inflated by an easily more efficient process that will drastically reduce the cost of infrastructure.
And have you guys gotten a lot of pushback already, even though this was a bipartisan committee or council that was created? How do environmental groups react to you guys?
They use the power of the media and the judges to cast aspersions on what we're actually trying to accomplish. At the same time, there's a tremendous amount of hypocrisy. You need cheap natural gas to fund and transmission lines to fund solar energy and the green revolution that they're seeking. However, when it comes to natural gas and some of the other pipelines that are a replacement to coal, they're extremely opposed to any permitting that allows these to transpire. And so it's one of these situations in which there's a general ignorance to how we actually fuel this machine called America, what the president says. And that there ought to be a more rational way in which we can build all infrastructure, that they know not what they actually use. So the same time that they're flushing a toilet or turning on their lights or flying in an airplane or complaining about congestion at airports or on roads and bridges, unwilling to recognize that those projects are significantly delayed from the environmental tactics. And many of the environmental groups are about fundraising, whether it is Earth Justice or Centers for Biological Diversity or many of the environmental groups. They're all competing against each other for very valuable fundraising dollars. Yeah, and they're not allowed to give kudos to members of Congress or to the president for streamlining this process. So instead of it being the apolitical third rail, recognizing there's no Republican or Democrat roads or bridges or water systems or pipelines, that they're able to raise money off this process, asserting, as you pointed out in the beginning, that somehow we're trying to kill birds and animals and fish. And that's not the case at all, including where the farmers who are better stewards of the land than probably anybody else that's a private property owner. Yeah, and again, it always goes back to this, like they always start from this false premise that there's a need for more regulation, that there's just not enough regulation, that our environment is just dying, and it's just not truth. It's just not the truth at all. It's gotten much cleaner over the past few decades, but they perpetuate that false narrative to promote their sort of radical agenda, whatever that is. I mean, the way you describe it, the way they sort of compete for money, kind of reminds me of Michael Crichton's book, State of Fear. It's an older book, but it's worth the read, and it's just. Well, no, I will tell you, as you mentioned that, in 2006, I, as a young staffer on the Environment and Public Works Committee, where I worked for Senator Inhofe for about 15 years as the head of the Environment and Public Works Committee, I asked Michael Crichton to testify a year and a half before he passed away, and he had just published State of Fear, and he was testifying on the idea of how there could be this groupthink about environmental catastrophe, and that can be a steamrolling effect. And it can bring in things like environmental justice or social cost of carbon, and these somewhat subjective terms that make it very difficult to actually build things. And if you're a developer or someone trying to build a transmission line or a rural cooperative, you may not necessarily care or have a political party. Yet this his exact point, which he testified in the committee, was that this hysteria can lead to extreme positions that it's hard to back off from. And then you add on to that NIMBYism, where folks don't necessarily, they want power and energy, but they don't want it going through their backyard, that you create a balkanized system where you not only have federal laws, but you have state laws, county laws, and the environmentalists pounce on all three of those to stop development at all costs, because they believe that somehow or another, the big profitable oil and gas companies, or the big profitable manufacturing companies, are not actually stewards of the land and don't have grandchildren and actually care about the country, and that their number one goal is to pollute. And so that is constantly the battle, and it is a false narrative.
Do you think in these environmental groups, do you think it's ignorance, or do you think that they truly just want us to be living off the land again? Like, is it just a totally different philosophy on how humans should live, period?
Well, I'll give you an example, because we talk in these terms about permitting and the rest. And the reality is, to give you a very specific example, let's say we're going to build the port expansion at the Port of Corpus Christi. You have the National Marine Fisheries Service at the Department of Commerce that has jurisdiction over salmon and certain kinds of trout because they are ocean-bearing fish. The Fish and Wildlife Service, that is the Department of Interior, also has jurisdiction over trout and because they're a river fish. However, these two agencies don't necessarily talk to each other. And then in Senate testimony in the Permanent Special Investigations Committee last year, under oath, I mentioned the facts, but oftentimes in DC, as you have talked about before, we live in a fact-free zone, where I mentioned the very real facts that happen in terms in which you have two biologists, two student biologists that are doing biological opinions for the Department of Commerce, National Marine Fisheries, and Fish and Wildlife Service. And instead of doing a concurrent review, reducing duplication and redundancy, they both did, the same contractor was hired to do the review of the salmon and the trout that were going out to the ocean, and then 3 months later did the same exact review in the same area of the river on trout, costing taxpayers $200,000-$300,000. Yet the two agencies didn't talk to each other. So oftentimes it comes to almost a government reform initiative where it's not about reducing environmental protections. It's about taking government, which oftentimes can become overly duplicative and bureaucratic, and just bringing common sense to the surface to make risk-based decisions and giving the public options. This permitting council, what we do is we have a permitting dashboard. We put all the expected federal actions on a timeline. And this is not a novel concept to hold government accountable, provide transparency, and we're not forcing yeses, we're just forcing decisions. That every time I bring that up under debate with the environmental community, they never answer those questions directly. They always go to a vacuous climate change debate or to a discussion of Republicans and Trump just want to kill the environment, and never answer those questions directly. In particular, at what point when we're fixing opportunity zones and economically depressed communities, at what point do we evaluate species over people, especially when we're getting to delta smelt and particular kinds of lizards or burying beetles, of which we know there are plenty of populations, but are stopping development using footholds in the law to tie these projects up in litigation until the project sponsor has no more money and eventually just abandon the project. And that has been the game plan for environmentalists and the rule book for the last 10 to 15 years.
Yeah, it's kind of infuriating to hear about, and I don't think people realize this, because I don't care if you're Democrat or Republican, you're wondering why they haven't added that extra lane to that road yet. There's a ton of traffic on it. It's really annoying. Why haven't they added an extra lane? Well, little do you know that this is why. Because while it seems like common sense, because it just is, like, there's plenty of space. It's not, you're not going to destroy the environment. You're widening a highway. But the amount of insane, and if people only knew the kind of processes that you had to go through to protect that lizard or whatever other funny little animals that you just mentioned, that common sense would say they're going to be fine. This is ridiculous. And even if not, like, it's worth it. We should widen the highway, and because this was my question as you were talking about the trout. It's like, well, you need the port. It's extremely important for our economy, and what amount of damage to trout would it change the project? I mean, what are they even looking for? I guess is the question, and maybe it changes from time to time.
In the council, I don't need any changes to the law. I don't need changes to the Endangered Species Act or to the Army Corps in the way in which they issue permits. However, if you're at Lake Texoma or you're down at Lake Austin, it shouldn't take 6 months even not for a big project, just to build a dock. And oftentimes what it is, it's the culture and behavior of the government employees who are put in an impossible position. These bureaucrats are not bad people. Unfortunately, what happens is the attorneys get involved, and these documents that really should be 50 pages and should be an eighth grader should be able to understand end up becoming 10,000 pages, and you need a PhD to understand. And what ends up happening is those regulators are put in an impossible position where they're trying to inoculate from litigation at every step. So you have these gold-plated documents that are adhering to the maximum allowable under law under those timeframes, rather than trying to do the minimums to try and reduce the costs. So we have the confluence of the environmental community that is pushing back from the court system, and then you have government employees that are a 26-year-old making 50 grand a year that's a biologist that now is a program manager that is nervous to actually say yes unless somebody up the chain gives them comfort to do so. So you have a situation of fear where it's impossible to make a risk-based decision to actually start treating citizens and others putting capital at risk. And when I say capital at risk, these aren't big companies. Oftentimes these are farmers that are trying to build a transmission line. They shouldn't have to spend 300 grand on attorneys to build a $500,000 60-mile wide transmission line to fuel farm operations. And so what the council tries to do and what the president's doing in concert with the Republican House and Senate is to provide some common sense to peel back the layers. And so we're not removing any of the environmental protections. We're just doing it smarter and with common sense. And I think that is the pathway forward, because we're never going to get 60 votes in the Senate and a majority of the House to overturn some of these hallmark environmental laws. But what we can do is do it the right way and do it concurrently instead of sequentially. I don't need Fish and Wildlife to spend 130 days to make a decision and then have National Marine Fisheries spend 130 days, and then the Corps waiting to that to finish to 130 days, and then going to the Coast Guard for another 130 days. We can do it all concurrently and put a higher standard on the federal family to come to a final decision much earlier in the process, and then engage with the tribes and with others non-governmental entities so that we don't usurp states' rights, and then we can actually build this stuff without offending private property owners and the rest. There's a right way to do it, and that's why this council, which was created by Republicans and Democrats, which is why I am always frustrated when I'm testifying in front of the House and Senate when we're criticized as an environmental steamroller, when in fact there is no evidence of the 250 million projects, half of which are renewable energy, in which we've ever done that, in which Trump has ever done that. It is all posturing.
It's crazy, and it's all the headlines you see. There's one headline, and I wrote about this in my book. It's The Hill in 2019. It says EPA proposes easing air pollution permitting process, and what I point out is, okay, immediately when you think of that, you think of birds falling out of the sky. You think evil Trump. He just hates environment, hates trees, want to allow more air pollution. And that's what you hear. And the Obama administration was the big protector of the environment, but not Trump. Now, when you actually read that article, because that's the headline, when you actually read the article itself is actually somewhat fair and balanced, and it's talking about news source review, and so in layman's terms, basically this news source review is, and you can correct me if I'm sort of getting this wrong, but I think I've got it right. Basically, if there's a factory or a power plant, it wants to change something about its infrastructure, it has to go through a news source review, and it just happens to be extremely expensive and cumbersome. All of the problems that you've pointed out manifest themselves. Maybe it's activists suing them, whatever it is. It takes a long time. It's very expensive. And so the administration wanted to change that. And what people need to understand is that it actually prevents power plants from becoming cleaner. It has the opposite effect. That's why that needed to be changed. It has the opposite effect of what it's intended, because it's so expensive to add a carbon capture facility to your coal power plant, for instance. And we've actually seen that play out just here in Houston with an NRG project. So it's just not what people think it is. And there's a million headlines like that every time you're trying to reduce regulations. Again, there's this false narrative out there that we barely have enough regulations, when in reality we're just burdened by it. So what would if Biden wins the presidency in 2020 and ostensibly just rehires everybody that Obama had, because I think there's a pretty good expectation that would happen. I think they'd be further to the left than before. What would happen realistically?
Well, this goes to what I started with about risk-based decisions versus the precautionary principle. It's a difference. Trump is about compliance, helping those in the private sector get to a period where they can actually develop the new energies and do the things that are necessary, including on new source review, to come up with the new technologies. These companies, again, are the ones that have to be incentivized to do business here rather than China, whether it's GE building a new facility or reshoring the manufacturing. Under a Biden administration, I truly believe the scales would tip towards enforcement, where you have massive fines and court orders and consent decrees and secret settlement agreements that come from the courts, rather than working with these companies on a compliance basis so that they can avoid the massive fines, which go into a justice fund that no one knows where that money necessarily goes.
Yeah.
Under this administration, what I always say is a private property owner or a farmer is a better steward of the land when it comes to species than anybody at a headquarters or any bureaucrat in DC. And this Washington command and control knows best enforcement is how the Obama administration worked. And we saw firsthand with the Clean Air Act that they put together and their Waters of the U.S. rule, where they were punishing farmers for building ditches that impacted prairie holes and things of that nature. That didn't work. Enforcement without effective compliance and stakeholder approach, and using those that are private property owners as partners in developing these projects rather than adversaries, is where it's going to go back to. And the courts aren't going to solve these problems. We don't need a judge making a science-based decision. We need compliance. We need recognizing that there are challenges to carbon sequestration and LNG exports. And when you keyed on a good point, which is pollution, on the national air ambient quality standards, we're really, their air now is cleaner than it ever has been before when it comes to particulate matter, mercury, lead in the air, the things that were part of the acid rain program. Yet nobody wants to give acknowledgement, because we talk about CO2 and the impacts on mining projects like Round Top Mine and some of the other critical minerals mines that are largely in Texas, that are going to be one of the largest economic multipliers in Texas. The environmental community, when I mentioned it in the hearing, I said, so you're fine using lead and mercury on gold mines in Africa and in China, and dirtying the planet that way with absolutely no regulation. However, you want to keep U.S. development that has some of the strongest environmental laws in the country, far greener than Canada and Australia, at bay, and basically prevent any new investment. If I was the head of a utility or the head of a natural gas company or a renewable company, many of which are also doing natural gas and oil and gas development, I wouldn't put any money in any of these projects, because I would be extremely worried that I was going to be mischaracterized and end up in 6 years of court documents rather than actually building the project. So when I worry under a Biden administration that the enforcement aspect rather than the compliance, teaching a project to fish is going to be the biggest issue. And that's what worries me.
Yeah, I'd be really worried about it too. And I wonder if there's a lack of investment even now, just because they don't know how the election's going to go. I think if Trump wins and you're still in charge of this steering council, I think there'll be a lot of investment. But otherwise it's less clear. What are some of the craziest stories you've heard? Because you just mentioned them going after a farmer because they want to dig a ditch on their farm. Again, to a common sense American, this is absurd. Why do I need anybody telling me about this ditch on my farm? That seems crazy to us. But that's actually what happens. I mean, what are some? Do you have any other examples that would just blow people's minds?
I was in Dallas at Irving at a conference a couple years ago, and again, I was in Boston at the National Conference of State Legislators in front of 7,000 of the state legislators, many of which own the actual assets, the water systems and the rest. And I asked them, what is the cost of a water on a monthly basis? And nobody knew the answer. I asked them what their state gas tax was. And these are the legislators that are ones that put forward the bond initiatives and the things to really build the physical platform of the economy. And no one knew what the answer was. And these are the people that are supposed to know. And so one of the biggest things, and it's not just the craziest story, is that nobody knows what things cost. Everyone thinks it's a public good. So when it comes to these issues of the road they drive on, or the water systems they use, or the pumps and pipes that are below them, it really is a situation where the crazy stories are that whether it's an environmentalist or Republican or Democrat, they only have about 60 seconds in their day to absorb information that is outside of their family, yet they like to watch and criticize the president because of the things he says or tweets. However, they're not willing to actually address the real cost of the goods that they use every day, and will never come to terms with the fact that a new Tellurian natural gas pipeline that is coming from the Permian Basin with new natural gas is going to reduce the cost of electricity by 20 to 30% on their summer electricity bill while they're running their air conditioning.
Yeah.
Yet won't acknowledge that, but that yet will read our NRDC, the Resource Defense Council, will read one of their mailers talking about how Trump is ruining the environment, but will never connect the two between the cost of their energy and the reality of the company that actually has to step forward and build that electricity. And so that's why it is the conflict. So the crazy stories are that the federal agencies are not the enemy. The federal agencies are in a battle where every decision that they make, there can be up to 52 different federal decisions on one 30-mile pipeline. Of those 52 decisions, every one of them the environmentalists can pick apart. And so what you're forcing is these federal employees that are that 26-year-old, that 28-year-old, that went to North Texas, or that went to SMU, or and is now a biologist, now not only has to build out a biological opinion on the impacts to the lesser prairie chicken or the sage grouse, they also almost have to pretend like they're an attorney and develop these 3,000, 4,000 page documents that are impossible to read, that ultimately will get litigated. And so you're making it very difficult for people to be civil servants, many of them which are former military, that are working at the Army Corps of Engineers on the civilian side now, making it impossible for them to actually give project sponsors a yes. All that does, as you pointed out, is a chilling effect on any new additional investment, because nobody wants to play this game, and they'd much rather just do something else.
Yeah, I mean,
that's really what worries me.
In one of these examples of, recently, federal district judge in Montana, he struck down a critical permit for thousands of infrastructure projects to move forward, not just oil and gas, but a lot of others. I mean, I don't think many Americans realize this. So this one random federal judge can somehow stop thousands of permits. How is that possible? Can you give us you know what I'm talking about? Can you give us can you give us the background on how this happened? This was... I think this has to do with the Keystone Pipeline.
That's Judge Morris in Montana. And really what the case there is, there's 13,000 nationwide permits. And a nationwide permit is a recognition that there are certain permits that are issued where the Corps of Engineers makes a determination that there is no impact, that in order to give a permit to dredge and fill something on what we call the Section 10 of the Rivers and Harbors Act, that the Department of Transportation has this as well. They're called categorical exclusions. It's a recognition that unless you're really having any impact to the environment, that a permit is basically issued, right? This goes through an exhaustive review. What the judge said was that, you know what, you didn't talk to the Fish and Wildlife Service and the National Marine Fisheries Service, and you didn't actually do an endangered species incidental take review on this general permit that you issue on 13,000 permits. Well, he was really focused towards Keystone. The irony of this, and the reason why this is somewhat laughable, is that even when the Army Corps of Engineers issues one of these nationwide permits, you still have to follow the Endangered Species Act and do a biological assessment with the Fish and Wildlife Service and do these other reviews. However, that one permit is just with the Army Corps of Engineers on a dredge and fill permit on navigable waters. It has nothing to do with the Endangered Species Act and the rest. However, this is exactly what I was talking about, where there are finer points in the law where environmental groups that are very skilled attorneys know exactly how to stop projects. And there's a playbook out of the Columbia Law School and Portland State and some of the other environmental law schools in which they have a targeted playbook on how to stop projects. And this is one of them. Now, the administration is working very quickly to update this new nationwide permit list that's updated every 5 years and to use the decisions that came from the court as a checklist, essentially, to override and to provide a list that exactly answers, even though it's an abundance of caution, even though the Corps of Engineers did nothing wrong, and that these permits have been issued since 1977. These same nationwide permits were issued more under the Obama and Clinton administration than they ever were under the Bush and Trump administration. However, all of a sudden now, these nationwide permits and this early determination that we don't need to waste paper and resources because there's no impact to some of these projects. The Keystone Project is a good example, or the Permian pipelines that are coming from the Barnett and some of the other shale gas with the shale gas revolution. They use horizontal directional drilling. They're 100 miles underground, and they go 100 miles underground for about 80, 90 miles. They never impact water. However, what the judge ended up doing was exempting the transmission lines for renewable projects that are right at the surface, that are far more dangerous and impacting water flow for fisheries and for American rivers and for Ducks Unlimited and for Trout Unlimited. However, they exempted those projects and purely went after oil and gas because he doesn't like the source of energy. And so those are the kinds of decisions we cannot leave up to the courts. And that what the administration is aggressively moving to ensure that activist governors and others, because the Trump administration also respects cooperative federalism. We have to also have, there's certain permits that have been delegated to the states over the years because states know best in certain cases for certain clean water permits, for discharge and the rest. And what unfortunately has happened is some of these governors, because they don't like the projects, or other judges at the district and circuit court level, have used some of these cases as a referendum on Trump rather than actually looking at the law and recognizing that there were no real impacts to human health and safety, yet have stopped projects. So in order to go after Keystone, because it's politically palatable, they've had the unattended impact of impacting 13,000 nationwide permits, half of which are transmission lines that connect up to solar and wind all throughout the Southwest.
I mean, they know that now, though. They just don't care. I mean, I just don't care. I don't understand how these people think. You know, you just, and this is why we're doing this podcast, because people have to realize the connection. Everybody can be in favor of infrastructure all day long, but guess what? You know, Democrats and these activists are actively trying to thwart the infrastructure that helps you. Even if it's getting, solar energy to your household. I mean, they're actively thwarting it. And on this really shaky basis, I mean, I'm trying to put what you said into layman's terms here. So you said, like, this particular nation, this is a permit that is, it's what was the term the type of permit that it is? What was the term?
It's called a nationwide permit. And the best way to describe it is, but when you go to do it, it's almost like getting a standard deduction on your taxes. Before you go through all of the rigmarole of putting together a 3,000-page application, the Corps of Engineers looks at your project and makes an initial assessment and says, you know what, there's these species here, there's these water here, yet you have no connection to any navigable water. It's not going to the Gulf of Mexico. It's not going to lead to pollution going other places. And we're going to make an initial determination that this project does not have an adverse impact on the environment. That has happened for the last 25 years. This judge looked at Keystone because one of the Keystone XL pipeline, because one of these nationwide permits was used on Keystone because it was drilling under 80 miles of earth and wasn't impacting any of the waterways that were impacting salmon or any of the endangered species that were mentioned in the case, and used that and said, you know what, the premise of the nationwide permit is defunct, and that needs to be set aside. And when I say nationwide permit, it's basically like it is an exclusion from having to do the big environmental work, because the initial common sense determination from the federal government is this project doesn't have an impact. So and that is the challenge. So
instead of making a ruling that this particular project, because I guess they could have said, hey, this particular project wasn't applicable to this nationwide permit, you should have done more scrutiny on it. But they didn't even say that. They said there shouldn't be any nationwide permit, period.
Well, Dan, it gets a little more ridiculous than that. 2 weeks later, there was a clarification from that judge once he realized that he impacted half of the renewable projects in the West, and said, you know what, this ruling, it doesn't impact any renewable projects with transmission lines or solar facilities. It's only going after oil and gas, even though the transmission lines are at a surface level and the oil and gas projects are far more scrutinized than any other any other project in this country. And so to build an oil and gas pipeline in this country takes a tremendous amount of capital and private equity and tax dollars to do. I'm not sure anyone's going to get in that business anymore because of these kinds of decisions that do not use facts at all. And 2 weeks later, to exempt all the renewable projects because of the Green New Revolution and Cortez and some of the other House members, this again goes to the recognition of, if you don't build the economic foundation of exporting our number one export, which is oil and gas, which could rebuild the economy, because you don't like the way in which it's being used, yet you conveniently with the hypocrisy of excluding the renewable projects, you're completely not on any legal ground anymore. You're completely an activist judge at that point.
And also, I think a lot of the audience might be wondering, okay, how does a judge even have this kind of power? And maybe we need to add some lawyers into the conversation to answer that. But it strikes me as blatantly unconstitutional that a judge could even make this kind of ruling, and that it's just not in the purview of the courts, and that the administration doesn't actually have to listen to it. I mean, I wonder if you can make that argument.
Yeah, every state has its own district, and that's the lower level court, and then it goes up to the circuit court, which is in this case the Ninth Circuit, which is California, Oregon, Washington, Montana, Wyoming, and the rest. That circuit over the last 25 years has been padded with judges that were appointed by the Obama and Clinton administration. This president has made it a focus, even though sometimes it's below the tweets and it's not necessarily picked up on the major media. Has done a very good job working with Senator McConnell and working with the Republican that are advising consent. Those judges are appointed by the Senate and voted on. Has finally done the work of putting Republican smart judges. And when I say smart judges, they're not outwardly Republican and conservative. They actually just read the law. And what they always say is back to basics. The law doesn't say you need to do this. So why are we asking these Americans? And everyone forgets that these are actual Americans that are putting capital at risk. It's not the Chinese, it's not the Japanese. Yeah. And while we're competing against the world global economy, we put ourselves at a disadvantage that oftentimes it's flabbergasting that we actually do this to American citizens that are trying to rebuild the economy. These kinds of judges at the district level have these cases and have primacy over doing it. And what you're forcing these companies to do is then appeal it to the circuit. If they get a bad decision at the circuit level, then they have to go to the Supreme Court, which is overloaded with decisions anyway, which could take a year or two to figure out a resolution. At that point, if you're putting money behind one of these projects, you abandon the project. And that is really where the environmental community is winning. It's like a vampire. They insanguinate these projects. They rob them of resources and investors. And by the end of the day, when they finally get a positive decision out of the Supreme Court, the project is already well beyond its economic feasibility and is lost out on its contract to sell its natural gas to India or to South Korea. And the Chinese, who are building the same sort of natural gas and oil export capacities in Africa and in other places, are beating us to the punch. So from a national, that's the reason why this president is right in so many ways, is that we do not have the economic resiliency to battle Brazil and these other countries, especially on the agricultural side, that have zero environmental laws, while we're holding ourselves at a disadvantage, not only with these judges, but with activist members of the House and Senate that are unwilling to accept the consequences of their decisions on the impact on being able to rebuild an infrastructure in this country that is 50 to 60 years old and is well beyond its useful life.
So I'll end with this. You seem pretty optimistic that we could actually get where we need to be within the law that we already have, as long as we treat the law correctly and just act with a compliant nature as opposed to an adversarial nature with our own population. But if we could go further than just, I think, let's call it good regulation, which is what you're trying to do. If we could go further than that and actually change the laws, what would be on your priority list? What is frivolous law right now that should be changed?
That's a good point. And even under a Biden administration, he's still going to have to build projects, right? You can't just ignore and go after Trump at every turn and go after Republicans at every turn as dirty polluters, because they're still going to have to build the same transmission lines. The Northeastern Republicans are still going to need natural gas pipelines to replace coal, yet they're going after natural gas pipelines at the moment. What I'm really scared of is the secret sue and settle, in which the environmental community goes after these projects. A judge then puts some of these project sponsors in a room in which there is no real court reporter. It's sealed, and then it's almost kind of like collusion in many cases, where they say, I'm always going to oppose this project unless you agree to this. And then this project sponsor then has to agree to all these terms and conditions that build up the cost of the project. Many of these projects are public utilities. The person that bears the cost of those decisions are ratepayers, are citizens. Yet nobody, I go back to my comment before about people only have 60 seconds in their day to absorb information that's outside of their family and driving to soccer practice and just living their normal life. And so what ends up happening is the cost of these projects is bills, and folks get so frustrated about the bureaucratic nature of it that they just go, you know what, I'd rather have a Trump who cuts through this BS. And so the sue and settle aspect of using the courts as a partner essentially to restrict additional development is something that I think that Congress could really go after on making these for-profit litigators, when they lose, actually paying for the litigation expenses, as opposed to what they get now is 5 to 10% of the decision.
Yeah,
and then
that makes sense.
There's no accountability for going after these projects, and everyone forgets the renewable and natural gas companies are not Republicans or Democrats. They're across the board apolitical. They're just trying to build stuff. They don't care who's in office. They just want to build stuff. And I think that we're getting to a point where it's easy to go after Trump and go after these projects because of the things he says. Biden is still going to have to rebuild if he was elected, but still have to do the same things. Yet the environmental community is just going to back down and then go after saving lions in Africa. Right? They're not going to go after the same sort of thing. So it's a giant hypocrite. The hypocrisy is palpable, and so that's why it's important for you and for others and for the listeners of this podcast to recognize that Trump and the Republicans are not trying to dirty the water or dirty the air. They're just looking for common sense, reasonable solutions and trying to communicate it to the layman, to the person that doesn't have a PhD, to be like, listen, you know, Republicans are the ones that got MTBEs and benzene out of gasoline, and they're the ones that went after initial lead and pollution and acid rain so that car paint wasn't being peeled off by pollutants that were in the air and particulate matter that was causing asthma. Yet now they've moved on to a separate thing. Let's go after climate change and some of these other things and stop these projects. So it's really going to be about fighting these battles at every turn. And although I said we don't need a lot of laws, it's the vigilance of you and other people in the House and the Senate to make sure that stuff doesn't completely go off the rails. Well,
that's good. I like to hear that. That actually seems like a pretty simple solution, and people need to know these things.
Yep.
You know, it's hard to get those solutions done, though. We'll appreciate you being there on the council to actually fight for that, and I'm sure there are many people trying to rebuild our economy that appreciate it too. And I think it's like you said, 7 years versus 2 years is a pretty big deal when we're trying to reinvest in America. So, Alex, thanks so much for being on the podcast.
Well, Congressman, I appreciate you, and thank you for taking the time and taking an interest in permitting. Hopefully, I've made it more exciting than what otherwise it would have been.
Yeah.
Thank you so much. I appreciate you and all the work you're doing, and I look forward to working with you directly on advancing some of these issues. Because again, Texas is one of the largest points of economic redevelopment in this country. It's one of the bigger high growth states, and that's where all the projects are. And so I have a huge focus on Texas, and I know you do too. And I look forward to working with you.
Well, thank goodness we have sane government here.